Before we really start to look critically at world religions in a much more specific way, I think it's important to look in a little bit of a broad manner at a definition of the term tradition that I think is going to be really helpful, and how this understanding is going to hopefully shape how we think of world religions in general, and then each individual religions more specifically. But before we do that, I always like to start with this painting here. Even more interesting for me than the painting is the title of this painting. Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? You know, it seems to me that the person who painted this in the late 19th century was quite wise about the questions that religions seek to answer. You know, whenever I look at religion in a much more kind of broad way, I think that religions are a comprehensive set of questions. You know, it's easy to think that religion is just trying to provide answers, beliefs, but I think that's much more of a Western idea, that religions are about belief rather than religions being about questions or being about something else. And so I think it's important to realize that the vast majority of religions share a lot of specific components. Now, they don't share all of these. For example, uh, is Buddhism classified as a religion? Well, in some circles, yes, and in other circles, no. And as you probably already know, Buddhists don't believe in a god. They aren't theists. There's no god at the center of the Buddhist tradition. And yet, Buddhism also carries similar components or shares similar components to the other world religions. There are exemplars, there are sacred spaces, there are sacred time, there are rituals that one participates in. There is a long-standing history of books that the different forms of Buddhism really adhere to. And so it's important to look at these belief systems, ethics, morality, books, rituals, worship, God, gods, ultimate reality, so on and so forth. But I'm going to argue here in just a second that one of the starting point of any tradition, and here's kind of the gist of this video, the starting point of any tradition is a story, is the narrative. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. There's a great modern philosopher towards the end of his career and nearing probably the end of his life, who has this quote. He says, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part?" In the West, we often think that belief is the central component of a religion, that belief is a central component of a tradition, that what makes somebody a part of some tradition is that they believe properly. Now, this has probably a lot of different historical roots, one of which, especially in our country, is the influence of Christianity upon the politics of our country. That unique is that Christianity, especially after it became kind of a Roman religion, became a religion about dogma, a religion about belief. And yet, there are several other world religions where belief is not central to the understanding of that tradition, but rather practices are, but rather how one lives one's life. It is not as belief centered as Christianity is. And so, what MacIntyre is really trying to argue here is, and this is stemming from his Paramount book on ethics, is that ethics is really born out of a narrative. And let me try to articulate this in a somewhat different way. He argues, and you want to really kind of get this early point down here. He argues that a tradition is historically extended. That's the first thing. It's something that goes back into time. You and I, even if we were to try to make up our own tradition, that tradition would be dependent upon other traditions that preceded it. So a tradition is historically extended. It goes back into time. It's socially embodied. There are people that put on this tradition. There are people that do this tradition. That it is something that happens in a social community, not in a social vacuum. One person in and of themselves really cannot be or cannot practice a tradition, cannot really perpetuate a tradition. And you'll see why here in a second. So a tradition, he says, is historically extended, it's socially embodied, and then he says it's an argument. And he goes on to say it's an argument precisely in part about the good which constitutes that tradition. And so, in the vast majority of work, and here I'm drawing from his pinnacle work, which is called After Virtue, MacIntyre argues that the foundation of a tradition is the narrative. And guys, I wish that I could have drawn this differently, that narrative would be down here, and then practice would be upon that, and then belief, and so on and so forth. But I guess I'm not that savvy when it comes to Google Slides. So down here, the very, very bottom, the foundation of any tradition, he says, is the story, is the narrative. And so when we're going to be studying world religions this summer or this year, what you're going to need to be focusing on is, what is the story? I'm not talking about like, what are the books? So in Christianity, I'm not saying what is the Bible, or in Islam, I'm not saying, oh, the Quran. But what is the overarching narrative that shapes that that in a very foundational way shapes that tradition? Let me give you an example that is not regarding religion. The foundation of America, I would argue, MacIntyre would argue, is the story. The story began in two places, I would argue. One, the native peoples who lived on this land. Okay, then what we now call the Native Americans. They were here. They were telling a story of this great land prior to the second group, the brave souls in Western Europe who decided to come across the ocean to try to begin a new country, a new place, a new experiment. And so whenever we look back at the history of our country, of who we are, whenever we tell our story, well, we tell our story in those two ways, about the native peoples who were already here, and about those brave souls who came to this land from afar. This is in our national anthem. This is in the history books. This is in the stories that we tell our kids. This is in the history classes that we teach children, teenagers, college students, and so on and so forth. And I started to allude to this, that story, that foundational narrative, therefore then shapes practices. Before sporting events, people in our country sing the national anthem. When you were a child, before school, you probably said the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, those are practices that are based on the narrative. They are shaped by the narrative. And what those practices do, again, the narrative is the foundation. Those practices, they reinforce that narrative. And the tradition, if I can go back here, is only as strong as how one can answer the question of what story am I a part? And so, a tradition has at its foundation a narrative. So again, what is the story of these particular religions? In Christianity, it's a story of creation. It's a story of human responsibility leading to the misappropriation of our use of freedom. And then it's also a story of redemption. So creation, fall, redemption, salvation, so on and so forth. The practices. Well, these practices in all of these religions that we're going to study are paramount because these practices are shaped by the narrative and then they reinforce that narrative. Here we're talking about worship. We're talking about rituals. We're talking about daily forms of devotion. These can be individual and these can also be communal. These practices then shape belief. Now, please get this, that MacIntyre, the Aristotelian philosophy, that the vast majority of the world does not focus rather on belief, but rather on what we would consider praxis, habits, what somebody does. For example, in Islam, you don't have to believe a whole host of things like in Christianity. You don't have to believe a creed. You don't have to believe like a list of 500 different things you might find in a catechism in a Catholic or an Episcopal church. What you have to confess is there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the prophet of God. And then what you have to do is you have to be a Muslim. You have to participate in the certain practices that a Muslim practices. Most formatively, you have to pray 5 times a day. You are something because you do it. And that's what's unique about Aristotelian philosophy. And that's what's really helpful about this influence of MacIntyre. that a tradition is what it is because it is something that is socially embodied. It is something that is practiced over time. And so I know that in the West, a lot of people, they focus then on belief. That belief is the central focus of any religion. Well, you are a Christian because you believe correctly, or you are a Muslim because you believe correctly, or you are a Hindu because you believe a certain way, or you are a Buddhist because you believe a certain way, or you are an American because you believe a certain way. And what this is really trying to turn that up on end a little bit is that you are a part of a tradition because you have a story. You belong to a story. That story shapes particular practices. Do those practices shape beliefs? Absolutely. But for MacIntyre, for Eastern religions, for Christianity before it became a Constantinian Roman religion, the vast majority of Hinduism, the vast majority of Islam, and even the vast majority of Jews today, they are people of a narrative and of a practice. Okay, these beliefs shape what we value. I would argue that Americans don't believe in freedom. They don't believe in free speech. They value those things. Those values are shaped by fundamental beliefs that the framers of our Constitution had. And today, if we properly tell the narrative and then participate in certain practices, we too may have those same beliefs. So these values and these convictions, here we're really kind of getting at the core of how religions try to seek to answer some of these fundamental questions. What is the problem? What has gone wrong with the world? What has gone wrong with humanity? Why is it humans misuse freedom? Why is it that we suffer? So on and so forth. And then finally, here's what I think is really challenging and interesting about MacIntyre's argument, is that actions are born out of our values and our convictions. Now, are often our actions very selfish in many ways? Well, yes. Well, that's because they are born out of these convictions that I value myself. I value my own time. I value my own ideas, my own reality. And so the challenge that I want you guys to consider is that as we start to study world religions, and particularly Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, think forward here. What is the main narrative of that tradition? This narrative is a meta-narrative. It is something that captures the hearts and minds of people. This is broader than the story of an individual book in a Bible, or the story of that is present in the Bhagavad Gita or in other different religious texts. It is bigger than that, than these practices, the way in which that narrative, that story shapes these unique practices, and then those beliefs that are shaped by that practice, and then those values and convictions that are shaped upon those beliefs, and then finally, ultimately, what is it that drives religious people to action? Well, it's all of this. Again, the foundation is the narrative. Those narratives shape the practices. Those practices shape beliefs. Those beliefs shapes what we value and our convictions. And then finally, those convictions shape our actions. And then why do I have an arrow over here? I have an arrow over here because our actions then allow us to go back and to reinterpret our narrative. Say, for example, the foundational claim in Christianity is to love God and to love your neighbor. Well, what happens when I don't love my neighbor? What happens when I don't love God? Well, I go back and I listen to my narrative again. The foundational action in Islam is to submit to the will of God. But what happens when I don't submit to the will of God? What happens when I really submit to my own will, my own desires, and not to that of Allah? Well, I go back and I listen to my narrative again, and I participate in certain practices. This is why in Islam, when they pray, they really lay prostrate in a position of submission. Then those practices will shape my beliefs and my values and my convictions. And then finally, someday, to use that Christian example, I really may love my neighbor as myself. Or in that Islamic metaphor, I may really finally submit to God. Recently, I'm recording this in the summer of 2018, and there is a volcano that is continually erupting in Hawaii. And I was listening to a piece on NPR the other day, and they were interviewing this lady whose house has been destroyed by the volcano. And she said, my 30 years of practice of yoga has finally paid off because I am at peace with what has happened. She said, I just lost all my house, my brand new, iMac computer, all of my possessions. But I'm okay with that. I am content with that. And she said that the reason for her being able to have such peace was because of a set of narratives that shaped certain practices. Those practices shaped her beliefs. Those beliefs shaped what she values. Those values shaped her convictions. And then finally, she was able to act in such a way that she was being true to the narrative, the foundational component of her tradition. So please remember that a tradition has three components. It is historically extended. They go back into time. They are socially embodied. People, communities do these. They practice them, and then they are arguments. Interestingly enough, and let me go back to the where we began, that all of these religions that we're going to be studying are asking the same questions. Where did we come from? What are we? And where are we going?